The host started this webinar. This webinar is this meet all the video settings, the act, more option, open chat pan. All the
Well, good afternoon, everybody.
Good
afternoon, everyone. We're just waiting a few minutes for the participants or all of the attendees to sort of be magically beamed into the session. So we'll just wait another minute or two, and then we'll be getting started.
But all the audio now unmuted.
Well, again, good afternoon. Welcome, everybody, as we continue our CUNY Accessibility Conference. Our session this afternoon is Promoting Universal Design for All Aspects of Instruction. What do faculty need to know? I'm glad you could all join us. We have about 60 attendees and panelists in addition to that. So we have a nice big group, which is lovely. My name is Maura Egan. I'm from Queens College, and I will be, I'll have the pleasure of introducing our speaker today. But before I do that, I'd like to give a visual description. So again, I'm Maura Egan. I am a white woman. I'm a middle-aged white woman. I have short, dark hair with probably a touch of gray. I'm wearing a green blouse, and I am working remotely today. So I'm at home, and I am in sort of an armchair rather than at an office-y desk. Again, it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Sheryl Burgstahler, who is from the University of Washington. Dr. Burgstahler founded and is the director of Access Technology Services, which includes a range of things, including technology. And I'm sure many of us are familiar with Dr. Burgstahler's work because many of the solutions that University of Washington has developed are kindly shared on the web. So, and I'm sure Dr. Burgstahler's work is familiar to many in this audience because she's spoken at CUNY accessibility conferences before. Dr. Burgstahler's latest book is her latest book is Creating Inclusive Learning Opportunities in Higher Education, a Universal Design Toolkit. And Dr. Burgstahler is going to be posting some links in the chat, and we will either forward them to the group or make sure that they're available after the fact to registrants. And the PowerPoint that she will be using will also be shared with conference registrants. And let me just also mention a couple of housekeeping items. We have 2 ASL interpreters, and we're very grateful for them, for their presence here. They are spotlighted, but you may also want to use the pin function to pin the interpreters so that they're at the top of your participant view. Also, attendees' microphones are set to mute and your cameras are turned off. If you have questions, you may either post them in the chat, and there will be a dedicated question and answer period at the end. Or if you need to use your microphone or your camera in order to ask a question, you can request that access in the chat, and we will make sure that your Zoom privileges are upgraded so that you'll be able to use your camera and or microphone to ask your question. And I think that's all of the technical housekeeping details that I need to say. So I'm also joined, other committee members are on the call, and my fellow moderator, Chris Fleming, will also be monitoring the chat. So I think now it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Sheryl Burgstahler. Thanks very
Hello.
much.
Yeah, thanks for that nice introduction. Yeah, I'm Sheryl Burgstahler, and I go by she and her pronouns. I'm blonde. I have a bright yellow shirt on, so I look like I'm ready for summer to be happening. It's not quite happening yet in many parts of the world, although I happen to be in Hawaii right now, and it seems like summer. But one notable thing is behind me, I'm in front of a painting that's in one of my rooms that just is a very calming painting, which shows grasses around a pond or some sort of water. And you might be thinking, wow, she's in a beautiful place. Well, I'm just in front of a beautiful painting. I am in a beautiful place too, though. So my talk today, promoting universal design for all aspects of instruction, what faculty need to know, is for those that teach faculty and those that are teaching an online course. You may know a lot of these things because making things accessible, we probably all know is just good teaching, but hopefully you'll pick up a few tips. I always do in talks like this, and that will benefit you or the people that you're working with, your students or whatever. So I do run the accessible technology services at the University of Washington. I started the IT accessibility team way back in 1984. So we were one of the early adopters at the University of Washington in promoting the accessible design of technology on campus. Back then, there weren't that many assistive technology devices, and there wasn't a lot of concern about the access to online resources because it was before the internet. But anyway, we continue to work to make sure that the University of Washington procures, develops, and uses accessible technology for the benefit of our students, faculty, and staff, all of them, including those with disabilities, and even people that might be coming to our website from outside the university community. And back in 1992, I decided that I wanted to do more. I had a background in disability and teaching, K-12 schools and post-secondary education. And so I wanted to take more of a holistic approach beyond the accessibility of IT to promote the success of individuals with disabilities, particularly in college and careers. And so I started the Do It Center, Disabilities, Opportunities, Internetworking, and Technology. And we received our first grant in '92 from the National Science Foundation. And we have luckily, and it's not all luck, but some of it we all know is luck for those of us who are grant writers, been able to get funding since then from NSF, but also from other federal agencies, the state, corporate foundations, and so forth, and even private funds. And we even started a Do It Japan program, a full-blown program in 2007 at the University of Tokyo with funds for that program that come from Japan, of course. And in 1999, we started the Center on Universal Design and Education that was funded by the US Department of Education and continues to be funding by that source, but National Science Foundation, other projects as we build enhancing that center with our new grants. We get a lot of different grants, as I mentioned. This program today is kind of sponsored by our Access Advance project I wanted to highlight. And this is a project funded by the National Science Foundation that's all about promoting the success of women with disabilities in STEM faculty positions, kind of one of our narrower target groups, but trying to focus on the environment, social issues that are involved in making a department in STEM at a post-secondary school more welcoming and accessible and inclusive of women who have disabilities. So we're working on systemic change, as we often do in projects. Pretty exciting program. We have a lot of women with disabilities that are working on it. And so we're bringing in a lot of different perspectives. Also faculty members who don't have disabilities, but can share their experiences and maybe their biases so that we know how to deal with those issues as well. So basically in our projects, though, we tend to be working with two different communities. We work with students with disabilities, particularly teenagers and early college students, to get them ready for college and then succeed in college. And through all of those projects, we really focus on self-determination, broadly defined, which I think of as the range of knowledge and skills and networking and technology that you might need to be successful in your adult life, including skills like self-advocacy, how to say what you need and who to say it to and when to say it, things like that. And so that's a big part of our program. We have summer camps, and we have online mentoring and so forth. And one of our unique things in this program, for a large program like this, is our students don't just come in and go out. We try to keep them involved in the program. And so we have students that have started in the program in 1993 in a summer camp that are still actively involved as what? Mentors, of course. And so they're mentors to the younger students that come in, but they've gone through similar experiences to do it. So they make excellent mentors. And then when we're working with faculty, which is like today, or staff or institutions or technology companies, our framework is universal design. We look at all aspects of those institutions and so forth, but we apply the basic principles of universal design. And I'll share that today. Some of you know about that. Some may be involved in applying universal design for learning, but I go beyond that, you'll see. So thinking about, well, what I think about when I think of does it mean to be inclusive on our campuses, and in this case, in our courses. And I think that means that everyone who meets the requirements, with or without accommodations, is encouraged to participate. And so if something's being publicized, like a course list or whatever, and it doesn't include a statement about how to request an accommodation, that is not welcoming. As a person with disability, that might not feel that you've even thought that they might want to attend. So we need to be welcoming. And then when we get there, individuals need to feel welcome. If you're teaching a class and you have a 5-minute video, like I do in my CUNY class, introducing myself, and you've used the computer generated captions, maybe from YouTube, I post mine on YouTube, and they're not going to be fully accurate without punctuation and so forth, that is not welcoming to a student who's deaf and relies on those captions for accessing the content of that video. Immediately, they're not welcome. Or if your syllabus is not in a format that is accessible to a person who's blind, by making them making it include text only, and in the case of PDFs, to also and other documents to include formatting that a person with a screen reader, a person who's blind using a screen reader, to be able to pick up on, and so they can find out what the heading structure is, the heading 1, heading 2, heading 3. Etc., or the list structure. If you put some bullet points in, that rather than using this list structure, that will make it more difficult for them to understand the content, and formatting tables and so forth. Otherwise, a person who's blind could read your content in your syllabus almost like one long sentence if there's no formatting. That would be kind of hard to parse that content that might be in there. And so that's what welcoming is all about. And then, or part of what welcoming is all about. Anyway, and they're fully engaged in accessible and inclusive activities, that you have thought ahead to make sure that your activities are accessible to the broad audience, not necessarily eliminating the need for accommodations, but minimizing the need for additional accommodations. So I think what we need is a paradigm shift from ableism to a celebration of all forms of diversity that include racial ethnic minorities, women, people of their identities, and certainly people with disabilities, that we just welcome that. Often on campus, when people who know me will run into me and they say, oh, I have this problem. And sometimes it's a student with a disability that's in their class. And I think, well, that's not really a problem. I mean, that's something we do every day, but they look at it as kind of a hardship for them to deal with this situation, rather than, oh, I'm so excited. I'm teaching art history and I have a blind student in my class. I've never really thought about how people who are blind experience artwork. This is going to be really exciting. Now, there is one thing I'd like to ask your advice about, and it's not that level of a conversation. I'm much happier with that kind of a conversation. We would need to move from a reactive reliance on accommodations alone to proactive. A universal design for accessible, inclusive, and sustainable products, environments, and services. We develop a course that is not just accessible to everyone, but it's also sustainable. We don't have to keep fixing it don't have to keep reformatting our PDFs or other things because we have someone who can't access the format that we have presented them in the past. And go from design for the average to design for everyone, to think of diversity. And when I'm talking to faculty, which I think I'm talking to some faculty today, it's like, it can't be everyone, of course, but we at least just to think about it, we should think about it, and adjust our teaching accordingly. And then if we need actually other accommodations, certainly we'll provide those as well. But once upon a time, we actually did this. So there. On the screen right now, I have a picture of a picture that was in the UW Daily, which is our student newspaper at the University of Washington. This was dated in 1970, so a long time ago. Some of you may not even remember anything from back at that time for obvious reasons. Anyway, the Daily is the student newspaper, and we have a picture of a student, and we see him from the back, and on the back of his wheelchair is a sign, and he's shouting clearly because the letters are all in caps. Ramp the curbs, get me off the street. Well, back then that was controversial. Imagine a place like ours, the University of Washington, with all of its sidewalks, huge campus, nice and hilly. That would be really expensive. And administrators pushed back on that and asked questions like, well, how many people using wheelchairs do we even have on our campus? I've only seen a few. So we're going to do it for them? Well, as we know, fast forward, putting curb cuts in sidewalks is a standard practice of sidewalk design. If someone put a sidewalk in your neighborhood and it didn't have curb cuts, I can bet you that some people would complain about that. For pushing baby strollers and delivery carts, for skateboarders, unfortunately sometimes, but curb cuts benefit all of us. And so now even there are tactile dots on curb cuts too. So someone who's blind will be warned if they're coming up to a street. And that benefits others as well. So here we are. We did it once. Let's try to do it with online learning. So this group knows probably a lot about the history of responses to human differences, but let's just take a look at a 1-minute history lesson here. There have been many places in history where in terms of people with disabilities, but others as well, we have eliminated them, excluded them, segregated them, and so forth. But then in the next phase, we've had a collection of things that we've done, which is particularly in the middle of the last century, where medicine made a lot of developments. And we focus on curing and rehabilitating. And then if we can't fully rehabilitate someone to participate in the average environment we've created, then we provide an accommodation. So we accommodate them. Notice that all three of these approaches are focused on the individual. How can we cure them? How can we help them be as functional as possible with rehabilitation? And how can we accommodate them? There's nothing wrong with these three things in the right context, but too often there's a focus on accommodations where we could actually focus on the environment instead and make things accessible. And so we wouldn't need an accommodation. So that's where we come into the phase of social justice. And if we think that a diverse population will be in our class, in our student body, then why should we be acting so surprised when they show up? In particular, for a student with a disability, we should be thinking about inclusion, having things born accessible, and then universal design. Universal design is just a framework, an approach toward greater inclusion and reaching our goals as far as social justice and diversity, equity, and inclusion on our campuses. And so I set out, and it's in the book that was mentioned, but to kind of really formalize this a little bit more into a framework of universal design. Because universal design, if you just define it, that's not a framework. Even if you look at the principles, that's not really a framework. So I started looking around on the internet, of course, and I found a lot of different versions of what people think of as a framework. But this is how I concluded my little adventure. I thought that a framework for, let's say, the universal design in higher education would have to have a scope. What are we talking about? Everything in higher ed, or one thing, online learning, whatever? Now we do need a definition that we agree to, whoever we are with this effort. And then we do need principles. Are there principles already? Should we create new principles? And then those principles should be developed into guidelines, which are just greater detail about how to apply a particular principle. We also need promising and hopefully research-based practices as well. And then there needs to be some kind of a process. How do you apply this? And so we should be able to do all of these things, fill all of these blanks in to have a toolkit that we could use on our campus or for our courses online. So as far as the scope of a universal design higher education application, it could be our DEI initiatives. I've been giving talks at conferences where they're talking about how to organize their DEI on their campus. And I've created this framework, or I've shared this framework as a possibility so that they include all types of diversity and don't just end up with siloed efforts for each disability and other diversity group they've decided to work with in their DEI efforts. Could be applied to instruction, or in this case today, we're applying it to online learning, but it could apply to services like career services or the registration or whatever. Could apply to this technology. I'm an IT person on our campus, and so my group applies it to technology. Physical spaces, projects, could apply it to conference exhibits, presentations like today, professional organizations. And then you also need to look at the scope as far as who are we talking about, including. I'm quite inclusive in that I like to think of everyone, and as even those that might pop up on the spur. We all have of the moment. You know, I'm a used car dealer's daughter, born and raised on the back end of a used car lot. And it's like I'm kind of a little, I maybe an underrepresented group in the field that I'm in. But seriously, what position they have, faculty, staff, and students, their race, ethnicity, cultural background, sexual identity, and sexual preference, and socioeconomic level, age, how about marital status, religious beliefs, values, academic interests, work experiences, specific abilities. But the key here is to think of diversity with a capital D. You know, everyone has different diversity aspects of themselves, and some marginalized in certain situations. But think about diversity of all these various groups. When I talk about DEI efforts, I said, well, that just makes it too complicated. I said, well, it's okay to start complicated and think about all these and be aware, even if, for instance, you're going to be working with your Black students on campus for some particular initial activities or so forth, or with your students with disabilities. But remember, people have multiple identities as well. So if you're working with Black students, make sure you include Black students who have disabilities, certainly, which isn't often done, by the way, in my experience. Right now on the screen, I have a double-edged arrow on the left to not able, to the right on able. And I like to consider ability on a continuum. For most people, the disability part, the definition of a disability or the medical diagnosis or whatever isn't that important to consider. We're teaching a class. So we need to think about all of our students being on a continuum as far as ability. I also like this way of classifying because everyone can rate themselves on this scale. Everyone has ability in a certain category. They don't necessarily have a disability. So the ability to understand English would be one thing. And a person might rate themselves low, a person in this group today, perhaps, because English is not their first language. Or it could be as a result of a learning disability, that English is more difficult to understand, or whatever. But you would rate yourself on that scale. You could rate yourself as far as social norms. Again, you might rate yourself low because of a disability-related issue, or it might be because you grew up in a different culture. The ability to see or hear, to walk, to read, print, to write with a pen or a pencil, to communicate verbally, to tune out distraction, to learn, and to manage physical and mental health. All of us in this group could look through those and find label disabilities that might be related to that ability, but we all have an ability. I also guess if we gave you this scale and you filled out a little form and rated yourself on all these items, there would not be two of us that had the same range. So diversity is quite diverse, and including people with disabilities. Another thing it's important for faculty to know is that most disabilities are not obvious to others. Just looking at a Zoom screen or even looking out at your physical classroom, you can't tell who has disabilities. Most disabilities are not obvious. And even fewer than 1/3 of individuals who have disabilities report them to the Disability Services Office. This is often a surprise to faculty, and they'll ask me why. And I said, well, I can't tell you why a person would not disclose if they have a disability, but I can tell you what's been reported to me by some students with disabilities. They're really worried about being discriminated against. They've had experience in that department, and they're afraid that a faculty member might not take them seriously. But anyway, so we can't rely on those letters that come to us saying what the approved accommodations are to know what accommodations would be valuable to other students. And the third thing is that disability services are primarily there to offer accommodations to individuals after an inaccessibility is discovered. Some disability services office offer more proactive things in training faculty and so forth, but they really spend most of their time on providing accommodations. So they're working with the student. And it's important to consider intersectionality as well. So those are the few things that kind of complicate the situation, which really leads to universal design, frankly. It's too complicated to just look at individuals and figure out what they need. So can we figure out what many people might need, and then do that, and then see what individuals might need in addition to that? So we'll do more in the universal design part and less than hopefully on the accommodation part. That wouldn't happen initially, by the way, so you can't solve all the problems at once, but that would be a goal that we would try to reach. So universal design, the definition that I use is the design of products and environments to be usable by all people, underline all, to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation or specialized design. Notice it doesn't mention disability, it's all people. So thinking about all people that might be in our class. And the challenge is, how can we make it so that it's accessible to everyone, and usable too, and then focus on fewer accommodations. To emphasize the process, which was part of my framework, I've got a picture on the screen right now of our universally designed name tag at the Do It Center. Remember 2 years ago when we were out at conferences in person? It's been a long time, but we have some name tags that are gathering a lot of dust in our storage room for those online events that we host. And we have a plastic name tag that has the paper insert, like so many of them do. You'll notice that the name, Sheryl in this case, is in very large bold letters. So that's the first thing we do, is we make sure the name is the thing that's emphasized the most. Why? Because the purpose of a name tag is that you can learn somebody else's name. And so we don't use up half of the name tag, which often happens at a conference, saying what our conference is, because it's our experience that most people at a conference actually know where they are. They want to know the name of another person. I've also found that most people seem to like lanyards. I'm not one of them. Makes the name tag hang too low, flips over, and then it's blank on the back, and you have to figure out whether you're going to turn it over for someone. Well, we solved that second problem by putting the name tag on the name on both sides. That's easy. But we also wanted to give people options in the name of universal design. And so at the end of our lanyard, we have a ring, metal ring. And so the name tag then itself, the plastic holder, has a clip on it. And so the clip then can be clipped to that ring, or in case someone like me is using it, they'll take the lanyard right off, and then I'd clip that to my collar. But some people don't have a collar and they would prefer a pin. And so inserted in that clip is a large safety pin. And so I can use that as well. One of the advantages is I may change my mind from day to day, depending on what I'm wearing. And I can do that. So the idea for the process of universal design, figure out what you're trying to do, and then think of making it possible for more people. Could be a range of abilities. It could be a range in just interests or preferences can have what they want. So that's the process of universal design. Characteristics of universal design include that it's accessible, so technically accessible for a person with a disability, but also usable. A man on my staff is blind, and he often points out products that are accessible but not usable. And they tend to be IT products. Remember, that's what we do in my group. And they are where a company will design an IT product, a tool perhaps, to be fully, they're not even considering accessibility when they're designing it. But after it's done, they somehow decide to deal with accessibility by coming up with alternative shortcuts or keyboard commands. He was telling about this product. It was a very small product as far as functionality that had almost 100 shortcut commands. What's he going to do? He's going to print these out in Braille or have them on the screen and use his screen reader to read them, and how he's going to sort them out, because he didn't even know what the product was doing at that point. So that's an example of a product being fully accessible to Hadi in this case, but not usable for Hadi. And then inclusive, that as much as possible, like the name tag, everybody gets the same product, but flexibility is built in. Just like our iPhones and our other smartphones, they build in accessibility features. Things like speaking to us, speaking the content on the screen, changing the background and foreground colors, zooming in to have larger characters. In the early days of computing, those used to be assistive technology devices you added to your system if a person needed them. But now they're just built in. So they're not assistive technology anymore. They're just plain old universal design of a good mainstream product. And then we always want to make sure we have a compatibility with assistive technology. So in our online courses, to make sure that we're aware what some of the issues are about for people that are using screen readers or alternative keyboards of some sort because they can't use their hands. We just need to be aware of what the impact is on them participating in our class. I'd like to reinforce this idea of inclusiveness that goes beyond ADA compliance. So on the screen right now, we have a picture of an entrance at the University of Washington, 2 steps going directly into the entrance, and on the side, a ramp, a rather shallow ramp with handrails. This is fully ADA compliant, but I would say it's accessible. I'd say it's very usable, but it's not inclusive. If I'm walking up to those steps with a colleague who's using a wheelchair, we generally part ways, and they use the ramp and I use the steps. And so it interrupts our conversation. Whereas the next picture is also at the University of Washington. That entrance, a similar entrance, has a very wide, gently sloping ramp into the main entrance. And so the main entrance is the one that is most accessible, and it's extra wide. So it's very usable too, in that we can still be side by side and someone can pass us on the other side. By the way, there are plenty of steps in this building, but you'll have to look for those. It's the most accessible entrance that is the one that everyone goes into, and that's what universal design is all about. So who benefits from universal design? Well, lots of people. You just take a look at captions on a video. Certainly people who are deaf, people who are English learners also benefit from captions. Kind of a mean trick when you think about it. If you don't have accurate captions on your videos for an English language learner who's trying to learn punctuation and spelling of words, it's kind of a mean trick if you don't have those accurate for them. Those in a noisy or a noiseless environment, like an airport in the first case, a baby's room in the second, have a slow internet connection, want to know the spelling of words, that's pretty much everybody, especially in an online course. And you want to find words quickly, content quickly. So you can search through those captions if you have the right tool to display your videos, which we do at the Do It Center, to search through all the content in a collection of videos, just like you can Google search for other things. And so let's move on to principles. We know principles for universal design for learning, for instruction. There are a lot of universal design for learning conferences, and those principles presented at those conferences. But I go to a lot of different conferences, and there's a whole group of other people that are designing physical environments for post-secondary institutions, other educational entities, and so forth. And they're practicing the 7 principles of universal design. And so those principles help you design a physical environment, making sure there's enough space for left and right-handed users, and so forth. And so that's one set of principles we need if we want to have a UDHD framework that covers everything in higher education, but also even in a hybrid course. If your online component is paired with an online on-site component, it's universal design principles that will guide you in those efforts to make that accessible as well. And then IT. There are a lot of issues related to IT. And many people that apply UDL don't take in the IT component, so actually are creating some inaccessibilities because of that. So the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines are accepted around the world, and they're very complex and in most of the cases, and are for IT people. But there are 4 basic principles that underpin them that are very easy to understand. In a workshop, I go through these 3 sets, but we're going to fast forward and get to the nutshell part. And so what I say for us doing online learning or other educational applications, there are 2 things to think about. Provide multiple ways for participants to learn, to demonstrate what they have learned, and to engage. Multiple ways, like to learn using a video and a handout. They can read it, they can hear it. And then ensure that all the technologies, the facilities, the services, the resources and strategies are accessible to individuals with a wide variety of disabilities. So not leaving out the accessibility part in addition to the UDL and the basic universal design for physical spaces. And so back to our first example here, make sure that that video is captioned accurately and audio described for students who are blind ideally. And also make sure that that document that they're reading is fully accessible, in particular accessible to a screen reader or to someone using text-to-speech software because of a learning disability or because they're an English language learner. And so that's kind of a simple way to look at it. And then you can apply these 3 sets of principles to pretty much anything you do on a post-secondary campus. We're zeroing in on online learning, so I'm not going to go through all of these, but there's a chart on the screen right now that has different aspects of instruction, services, information technology, and physical spaces, how they would be applied in those 4 different contexts. And so in the case of instruction, which applies to our topic today, class climate. How do you create a class climate that's welcoming to all of your students with all that have characteristics of all disabilities and also other diversity characteristics? For instance, I have my students introduce themselves in a little section, one of the bulletin board sections in Blackboard. And many of you do this as well, but that's a welcoming experience where people can share a little bit about themselves, whatever they're comfortable with, and kind of get to know each other. And me, I post in there as well. Interaction, physical environments and products, delivery methods, information technology and resources, like choosing the technology you're using in your class besides the Blackboard system, feedback, assessment, and accommodations. I always keep accommodations on these lists like this because we can't forget that some students are still going to need accommodations beyond what we're doing as a universal design feature. What I do is encourage instructors and staff to consider the characteristics of students who might engage in a class or a service and the assistive technologies they might be using. And so here I have 4 individuals, and I actually think of these 4 people when I'm designing my class. And if I can make it accessible to these 4, then most people will find it accessible to them. So there's some racial and ethnic diversity within the group and gender diversity, but let me focus on the disability diversity. Zane is deaf, and so she's a constant reminder of anything that's presented in audio needs to be captioned or audio or described. And Anthony, he has multiple physical disabilities. He uses a lot of very cool technology. He doesn't have a usable voice, but he can use a computerized voice, so he can use the telephone, and he connects with environmental units, and he has a lot of technology. There are thousands of devices, and learning about them would be really, really interesting. And even though I know quite a bit about them, what you need to know as an instructor is really only one thing. For people who are using alternative devices because of a physical disability, you can assume that that device, the assistive technology, will emulate all that we can do on the keyboard, but not necessarily the mouse. And so that means if you're developing a website, for example, you need to make sure that even if there's a pull down menu that you use the mouse for, that you can reach that content using the arrow keys or some other way on your keyboard. And then Anthony, he can access it with that fancy dancy technology that he's using. And also, when you're looking for technology that you might want to include in your class, can you operate it with the mouse alone? That's one check to see if it's accessible. Make sure that you can operate with the keyboard alone. And Jessie has multiple learning disabilities that make it difficult for her to get content on the screen or the keyboard through the keyboard, but also to read. And so with her multiple technologies, the thing that impacts accessibility is she needs access to the text. And so PDFs, for instance, that are scanned in, she cannot access those with her screen to text software. And so we need to make sure that she has access to the text. Hadi, that I already mentioned, he is blind, and he also needs access to the text in those PDFs. But he needs some formatting as well, the heading 1, heading 2, heading 3, so he knows what the level of the heading as he's reading through that text. And so he then would have access to that. So we actually went through, I actually went through with a lot of looking at research reports from online instructors, my own experiences, even students with disabilities that we have on panels in many of the programs that we offer, sharing their experiences in online learning, what all these people had to say about it. And I set about to make a list of, I was going to make it 10 tips and it ended up to be 20, but ended up with 20 tips for getting started. So faculty can get started and see that not everything's really hard to do. And it can be done incrementally. And there are how-to references for each of the tips. So in your chat, you'll see I have the URL for this 20 tips document. If you want to go directly to it, but it's such a popular document. If you just type in 20 tips, 20 as a number, you'll probably get it as a first hit. So number 1, use clear, consistent layouts, navigation, and organizational schemes. Particularly students on the autism spectrum and with certain types of disabilities, particularly when they affect executive functioning, they often point out inconsistent layouts, that it's hard to find things in the course and so forth. And there isn't consistency, and so they get confused. And so that's something that we can all do and improve on all the time. If a student can't find something, ask yourself, or even ask them, why did they find that difficult? And then fix it the next time you teach the course. So that student would have been able to find what they're looking for. Use descriptive wording for hyperlinks. Hadi likes to skim through pages, websites, and see what they're linked to. But if you format your content page, which is HTML2, or your website, and you decide to name them all, click here for consistency, that's what he hears. Click here, click here, click here. So just simply naming what you're linking to, like Do It website, CUNY website, or whatever you're linking to, would allow him to skim through that page like other people and decide what he wants to link to without trying to go back and looking for that surrounding text to describe it, or just to use trial and error. Use a text format, structured headings, lists, tables, styles and formatting tools within Microsoft Word or PDF or whatever you're using. Already talked about that. And just plain avoid PDFs. I've taught online since 1993. I actually taught the first online course at the University of Washington, and it was long before the internet was widely used, if you can believe that, or the actually the World Wide Web. There was an internet, but no World Wide Web tools. And so avoid PDFs. Do not use scanned images of PDFs, certainly, but they're difficult to make accessible. You can, so if you want to invest in a workshop, you can do that, but the rules are kind of different for a Mac and a PC, and for different versions that a screen reader might be using, or different versions of the guidelines. And if you go back to update them like it's a syllabus, it's hard to update and still maintain those accessibility features. And sometimes you can lose them even from transferring from Microsoft Word to PDF. So you can avoid them. And you might say, well, yeah, but I link to a lot of PDFs. Ideally, you would link to PDFs that would be accessible. If they're not, one thing to do is search for the title of that document. Sometimes you can find an accessible one that's in Word or HTML. If not, you can make the decision that you're going to try to deal with that issue, contact the organization or something, or that's something you might decide, I don't have time to deal with that now. I'm going to let that be an accommodation, but it's an accommodation. So don't use that PDF the first day of class, maybe not even the first week of class, because a student may not be able to access it. Be sure to use text descriptions for content and images that will benefit Hadi. Large sans serif fonts, uncluttered pages, plain backgrounds. I'm demonstrating that today. That benefits a lot of people, but particularly people with visual impairments that only can see a part of the screen at once, and some types of learning disabilities. And attention deficits by not having a lot of distraction on the screen. High contrast color combinations. Kind of avoid problematic ones for people who are colorblind. You can actually check for that online. But another way to do it is just don't use color alone to convey meaning. So if their student has to make a choice between two items, don't have them both round circles, one green and one red. Have one a triangle and one a circle, and then the green and red as well. Those videos, we've already talked about captioning. Audio description is good too, or think about the way you've done your video and describe everything on it like I'm doing today. So you don't need the extra audio description. Use a small number of technology tools. Some people aren't just as excited about technology as you are, or I am, or somebody else is. And make sure that they're accessible. You can check by using the keyboard alone. Also look at their website. Do they have an accessibility page to tell you all the wonderful accessibility features they have? If they don't, it's probably not very accessible. Otherwise, you're going to need an IT person like people on my staff that can test for accessibility. Point to specific resources to gain needed technical skills. And so in a class, if it's in Blackboard or Canvas or whatever, and you might point your students in your syllabus to a good video or a couple of Q&As that would be most useful for starting your class. That helps people who have never used that learning management system before, which might only be a few, but if they just go to the Q&As, they might be overwhelmed by the number of videos and written materials to check from. So help them get started so they can get going on that class and be successful the first week. Use multiple ways to learn and speak aloud content presented in visuals. Multiple ways to communicate and to collaborate. In my syllabus, I include a statement that invites them to meet with me, of course, one-on-one. And I said, well, send me some options for meetings, some times, but also how you'd like to meet. By Skype, using the bulletin board system, using email, using Zoom. I give them control. I give them agency. They can decide how we want to meet, as that's a particular case where it can be up to them. I'd like to meet on Zoom, but it's not about me. It's about the student in that case. And then multiple ways to demonstrate learning. We talked about that. Address a wide range of learning and language skills. Use plain English unless there's a reason for not doing so. And then spelling out and defining acronyms and jargon. I like to use the expression low-hanging fruit, but the first time I use it in my class, I always say what I mean by that. Because I think, well, maybe if you're in a different culture, you wouldn't know what that means. It's kind of an odd sequence of words if you think about it. And so I say, by that, what I mean is, and tell them. And clear instructions and expectations. Students on the autism spectrum particularly really are disadvantaged when you don't have really clear, concrete assignment descriptions and then the expectations. When I have students that get confused about the descriptions I've given, then I look at what they're confused by and I try to improve that description for my next class. Make sure examples and assignments are relevant to a diverse audience. Outlines and other scaffolding tools can be helpful. For a lot of students, adequate opportunities to practice. You're teaching a math class or whatever. And time for activities and projects and tests. There's some disagreement on whether you should do this, but I like to put all of the two, actually there are two major projects in my class. And I include very detailed descriptions and expectations for each in the syllabus. Sometimes that can feel a little overwhelming to students, but I err on the side of giving them more time to work on those projects because they can start from day one thinking about how they're going to approach those assignments. Giving feedback on parts of assignments and corrective opportunities, particularly for those large projects. So we've gone through this whole framework that I developed, and you can flesh this out with your own details as far as the scope you want to apply it to, the definition, the practices, the principles, the guidelines, practices, and process. So I like to think of universal design as an attitude, as a framework, as a process, as a theory even, that applying these will improve the success of people with disabilities. It values diversity, equity, inclusion. Like I said, it can be used as a model for those efforts. It can apply to all educational applications. It's not just used, for guiding pedagogy like UDL. It can be used for all applications. Promotes best practices. Absolutely does not lower standards. It's proactive. There's the kind of thinking ahead. Can be implemented incrementally. Is for the benefit of everyone. And minimizes the need for accommodations. I've mentioned DEI a couple of times, and so I want to just briefly show how you could use this UDHE framework to underpin a UDI effort. And so here I have a flow chart moving to the right, or some might think of it as a logic model. And we have 7 boxes, and these arrows are going to the right. So on the left-hand side then is we have the vision. Start with the vision. On our campus, when we have DEI efforts, I think about inclusive campus. That's what I want. An inclusive campus is the vision. And that's consistent with our university. I may be applying it to IT because that's my division. Values. I can find this on the website easily. Diversity, equity, inclusion, and I add compliance. We're always thinking about compliance, and it does fit in here. And then the framework, and that's what we just went through. Use the UDHE framework. Current practices, coming up with a list on a spreadsheet of current practices, stakeholder roles, funding, policies, guidelines, procedures, training, support, thinking of all these things that you think are most important. And think, what do you want the new practice to be? With your new vision of an inclusive campus, how do you want to change the stakeholder roles and the funding and the policies, et cetera? That's going to be most of the work in your DEI effort. And then looking at the outcomes and the outputs, developing some measures and benchmarks, data analysis, reports, that sort of good stuff. And then try to guess what impact you've had on those values that you established of diversity, equity, inclusion, and compliance. And then as you start to implement some of these practices, go back and revise your plans. We applied this to IT on our campus because, again, that's where my efforts are specifically. Although we've encouraged the University of Washington in general to apply universal design framework, and they do to some extent here and there. Unfortunately, I'm not in charge of the whole university. Isn't that sad? And one other thing, just one other point to think about is think about the assignments that you give. We've talked a little bit about accessible IT and so forth. Most of the inaccessibilities in an online class are created by the instructor, not by the technology that they're using. Most learning management systems can be used to deliver an accessible course, but you have to think ahead of what assignments you get. So I'll just give one example. I have an assignment in a universal design in higher education course that I teach at CUNY, where I do a lot of field trip type things in my class. So they have to go out on the internet and they have to find an image of a physical space that has a universal design feature as they would consider that to be. It can't be from a universal design website or even labeled as universal design. So they have to be pretty clever to find something. Then they come to the bulletin board and then they will post attach that to their response to the question about why did you choose this image? What is in the image that suggests universal design? And then I think, well, okay, let's see, who wouldn't be able to do this? Obviously, a person who's blind wouldn't be able to do this. And so just at the end of the description of the assignment, then I say, alternatively, you can describe a location that you've been in where you've witnessed or you experienced a universal design feature that you want to share. And then I also say, for those of you with the attachments of the images, be sure to describe in alternative text what's in that image. Since we're talking about universal design a lot, they've already learned about alternative text at that point. So what I've done in the assignment then is created what would have been an accommodation that I would have given to a student who's blind or for some other reason couldn't access images if they asked for it. But they didn't have to ask for it. And by the way, several people take that second alternative when they're doing that. So when they're doing the assignment, and they're not, I guess I can't say for sure, but I don't think they're students who are blind necessarily, but they think of an environment where they were in and they saw some universal design. So on the screen now, I have the little more information about that first post that I made in chat with some URLs, accessible technology website about how do you make that PDF accessible? Maybe you're all kind of interested in that now, go there. The Center for Universal Design in Education, and you'll find more about the new book on inclusive learning opportunities in higher education, a universal design toolkit, but you also can find that 20 tips publication and a searchable knowledge base with over 700 Q&As, case studies, promising practices. And you'll also find a link to the Access Advanced program that I mentioned. And my email address again is sherylb@uw.edu. You can ask questions, make comments, maybe something you thought I missed that I should have had in this talk. But also you can join our Universal Design in Higher Education online community of practice. So that's what I have for you today.
Alt V.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. And we do have a number of questions for you. And in addition, you got a lot of agreement in the chat, a lot of clapping hands, and a lot of positive feedback throughout your talk was coming in through the chat. So thank you. And I think Chris has a couple of questions he's gonna share.
Yeah, so a couple questions came in. Some of them you may have answered already, and I combined one or two into one question because I think you may have already answered. But the first of which is, what are some ways you or your university succeed in getting buy-in from for UDL from faculty and staff?
Oh, that question. I've never heard that one before. Well, I'll have to start by saying I don't have full buy-in from all faculty and staff at the University of Washington. We have efforts that are top down and bottom up. And so we're consistently working both directions. I can say our bottom up efforts and actually our middle out efforts have been the most successful. By middle out, I mean kind of the middle manager type people that have connections above them and below them as far as their position in the org chart. For one example, and this is my unit, actually, not my the whole university, but we have an IT accessibility liaison group. And these are volunteers that are interested in accessibility of IT, including online learning. And they have signed up to just be part of this group. We have a low bar to be accepted in this group. You have to want to make things more accessible. You have to be committed to learning, continually learning more about making things accessible, and to promote accessibility when you have a chance. And so they just say yes, yes, yes. And we have 3 meetings a year that are half days. And we really can get into depth on specific topics so they can learn about PDF and other document accessibility in one of these half days. And they can learn about videos, all you need to know about captioning and audio description. And so we've had quite success. We have over 160 people around campus at different levels. And we've had outcomes from that group. One example is the business school. We have a liaison that is in the business school. He's in their IT support group. And he was instrumental in getting the business school to standardize on captioning every video that faculty use in their online classes. And so that is automatically done by that central unit. So the faculty member does not need to do it themselves, as I was describing today. That's a great outcome. Also from that group, we've had efforts within the College of Education And I have an affiliate position over there, I have to disclose, and so I had a little bit more clout. But we've given training over there multiple times. And finally, their IT support group adopted the practice of accessible design or universal design. They actually teach their own courses now on the 20 tips document as the handout. And also a course on Ally, which is an add-on feature that we use in our Canvas system to, it's an accessibility checker. And so that's been, we've had some outcomes from that, but it's been years in coming. So it's very difficult to the higher level buy-in. Then we offer things to individuals. So every, the last Thursday of the month at 3 o'clock, we have a webinar, and we have the same, we just roll around the same topics. And so I teach one on accessible online learning, similar to this talk. And then we have somebody that has one on designing accessible PDFs that follows up on that, and the video one, and so forth. So we have those classes as well. Even Hadi does one on using a screen reader to check for accessibility. And so that helps. And we have a very comprehensive website. The first one that's on the screen here, Accessible Technology, that tells you step-by-step how to make your resources accessible, and then links to other resources for more detail. So, and then we have sessions. We do have Hadi has a Meet with Hadi session. I think he's doing that once a month. And you can meet with Hadi, and you'll go through your own website, and he will help you make it more accessible. And we have other programs like that as well, an online community and so forth. So no, I don't have top level buy-in everywhere, but I have it quite a few places. And usually people, if you present it right, will be favorable when you talk about universal design. It's more in the implementation stage. You know, how can someone argue that you shouldn't make your campus inclusive? And universal design is a way to help you do that. And so people agree on that. And so try to get those high level administrators to agree on that part anyway, and then remind them that's why you're promoting universal design in everything you do.
Thank you. So there's two more questions, I think. One of the first of which should be quick. I think it's to ask, thank you for the incredible talk. How often do you teach the UDL course at CUNY? It looks like it's through CUNY SPS. Can you confirm that?
Yes, it is. I teach it once a year, fall term.
Thanks.
So
Thank
I'll be
you.
doing it in August again. So, but if we just get a huge number of people, I'd be happy to teach it twice.
The next question that came in, and possibly the last, is I believe the initial advice years ago was to provide captions in preference to transcripts. Now that there are interactive transcripts, is that still the advice? Are there DIY tools for creating interactive transcripts? Thank you.
Oh, wow. I think there are some modifications to that, and an interactive transcript is certainly preferable to a separate transcript. The whole idea is you want to make sure that the visuals are synchronized with the transcript. And so that's the way you check if they're appropriate. I don't know of any tools specifically to do that. We do in our Able Player. This is this tool that I mentioned that actually is a kind of like a YouTube sort of option where how you could present videos. And so in the Do It Center, if you look for our video page, we are using that tool, and you can learn some information about it. It's freely available, but it takes a technical person to install it and integrate it, let's say, within your Drupal or other content management page. It's not trivial. But if you look at the features in that one, it has an interactive transcript. It has the capability where you can search all the captions to find particular places in the videos. You can slow the videos down, and it's fully accessible to a person with a disability to operate. So that doesn't specifically answer that question, but I do think that that's, and I'd be happy to pass that on to my IT accessibility team lead, Terrell Thompson, if you wanted to email me and remind me to do that, because that is an interesting question.
So I think, so thank you so much, Dr. Burgstahler. I think that is the end of our Q&A, but there are also lots and lots of thank yous and positive feedback rolling in the chat. So I'll pass it off to Maura to
Well, I'll
wrap
say
up the
one
session.
thing. I have a
Sure.
question of my own though, because I always have my own question for Q&A, because it's the one that's most commonly asked. Other than the first one that was asked today, the other one is, how do I get started? For a faculty member that hasn't thought about this, this is a pretty impressive list of things to do. And so they say, well, how do I get started? I said, well, first of all, get started, just getting started. And think of maybe a few things here that you're already doing. You're convinced that you're already doing these things. Just cross those off the list. So all of a sudden your list is shorter. And then choose something. Maybe you're thinking, wow, I do a lot of videos and I've never edited my captions. Go back and do that. Just do that one thing. Maybe you have your syllabus in PDF. Think about just putting your syllabus using cut and paste into the content management page, first of all. But also if you want an attachment, do it in Word. Word is very easy to make accessible. And so you can make sure that you use the heading structure within Word, make sure you have alternative text for images, make sure that you use the list structure, styles, and so forth, make that accessible. And use that as your attachment. I don't particularly like using a lot of attachments in my class because I don't like to have people go to a secondary place. I'll link to website things and other people's PDFs, but as far as creating ones myself, but the exception is the syllabus. I tell my students, I want you to take this syllabus and I want you to edit it into your own. Now you can't change the grading scale, but other things to guide yourself through the course. For example, I give a timeline and I tell you like when the project is due. Make a timeline about when you're going to get started on the project and maybe the steps that you're going to take, given that I've already given you the instructions for that. And take out some things in the course syllabus that don't really apply to you. Like maybe the disability resources statement referring you to that office and you're not going to use that service. Maybe take that out so there's not so much clutter in the syllabus. And so I want them to have the attachment as well. And so I'll do it in an accessible Word document. And so kind of weaning yourself off of PDFs. Some people really love PDFs. And when I ask them, it's usually like they want to preserve the structure and then they also want to protect their content. Well, PDFs, if someone gets an access to your PDF, no matter what format you've given it into, they can use OCR and they can get that content. So, and also maybe I'm just not popular enough, but I've never had anybody steal my syllabus. I wish they would and teach more things like this on their campus. But anyway, so I think the last word that I like to give is of advice is get started somewhere and do some of these things. And also to remember, this isn't the end product of the list you can make, but it's the beginning. And most of the products you're going to be using, including Word and PDFs, and even your learning management system, will have accessibility guidelines within them as well. And so you can use those. Now you know a little bit better why it's important to either not use PDFs or to format them properly and so forth. So you can think about Hadi and you can think about Jesse. They both need PDFs that are formatted in a correct way. So that's all I have to share today, but thanks for joining me. I'll just have to leave now and go down to the beach. How about that?
Thanks. Lucky you. Well, this has been great. I always think I just want to mention that your website is very generous in terms of if folks haven't visited, there's lots of good resources there. And I think it's really great that the acronym for part of your office is Do It.
Yes.
So, that's in some ways the message that, just do it, make a start. And if anyone's feeling overwhelmed, just, start with something as you just said. So this has been a very helpful and thought-provoking presentation. There's lots of thank yous coming in the chat. There have been questions about saving the chat. We will investigate that, but just in case this, it doesn't answer your literal question about how to save the chat, but we will pass along the links that have been posted in the chat, and the PowerPoint is coming. And
Sheryl.
we will make sure that the PowerPoint gets and the resources get disseminated to registrants. So I wanted to thank everyone for coming, and just to mention that we another another exciting day tomorrow, which begins with our keynote at 11 by President Frank Wu of Queens College. And we have another, series of presentations tomorrow. So I hope everyone can join us. And remember, the link that you used to access today's conference is the link that you need to use for all sessions for tomorrow and for Thursday. So hope everyone stays well and enjoys the rest of your day. And thank you all for coming. Does anyone else on the committee have anything that they need to share with the group, or is everything covered? Great. Well, thank you very much.
From
And
Claire Wilson.
thanks, Dr. Burgstahler, and take care, everyone.
A.S. Ellen. From
I'm not sure how we end
Peter.
how we stop the recording.
Okay, let me stop it.